So we're going to talk about the law for homeschooling, and then we'll go into the legislature a little bit. So in California, any of you in my last session in here? Okay, great. So in California, we have a big ed code. It's like the size of the biggest dictionary that you might have at home. It's massive, it's thin pages, lots of tiny words, lots of rules and regulations for how schools work in California, but all of it, almost all of it, has to do just with public schools. And so when we talk about private homeschooling in California, the only laws that apply to private homeschooling are about 2 pages from that whole big book. It's a massive, heavy book, but most of it doesn't apply to private homeschooling. We have an incredible amount of freedom in California when it comes to homeschooling. In fact, when I go to national homeschool conferences and talk with other folks, attorneys that talk about the legislature and the laws on homeschooling in other states, there's a lot of other states that are worse to homeschooling than California. And they're shocked at California, you know, the leading edge of progressivism in California, and we don't have more strict laws on homeschooling. They're shocked because we actually are kind of a unique organization, FDM, where I work. I've been working for 20 years in the legislature in Sacramento, but our organization was started back in the 80s by the Christian Home Educators Association. That's helping put this event on here today. Back in the 80s, they realized, along with Homeschool Legal Defense Association, who's based in Virginia, that California was going to be trouble. Even back in the 80s, they realized this, and they said, we need to have an organization just to keep an eye on homeschool laws in California. And lo and behold, in 1986, there was a law written to actually ban homeschooling outright in California. And what the penalty was for parents that disobeyed was jail. And so that was written in 1986. Unfortunately, it didn't even go to a first hearing. The author of that bill was actually convinced to change his mind and pull the bill. But we have had lots of proposed bills in California that would have regulated homeschooling. Even just a couple of years ago, we had some proposals to require teacher certification and require mandatory testing and quarterly review of your curriculum, things like that. But we don't actually have those laws in California. We have very minimal, and this flyer kind of goes through the basics. If you look at the different options here for legal alternatives for home education in California, there's the single-family home-based private school, there's the private school satellite program, and there's the private tutor and public school ISP or charter school, which is still under the government schools. And so I work to protect the freedom to do either a single-family home-based private school, which is private education in California under the private school law, or a private school satellite program, which is also under the private school law in California. Now, the difference between these two, they basically have the same laws, but the difference is if you're creating a private school in your own home, it's a single-family private school, you're in charge of it, and you are the authority. But you're also the one with the responsibility to make sure that everything gets taken care of that's supposed to get taken care of. And some people don't want that responsibility, the paperwork, which is not that extreme, but some people don't want the responsibility of keeping the cumulative file for the student, the record of attendance, things like that. So that's when you can have a private school satellite program, which is maybe either a campus-based school might have a homeschool program for that school, or it could be just a group that has their own independent program. It's an umbrella school where you have multiple families functioning under the same administrative unit or person that keeps the books for all those families. So you can choose either one. There's no major issue of choosing one over the other. It's a matter of if you feel like you want more accountability and you want somebody else to keep your records, you might choose the PSP. versus if you want all the authority, you want all the ability to make your own decisions, then you can create your own private school in your own home. So either one of those does have the basic principles of the basic laws where you have to teach in English. That's the number one in the Ed Code for private schools is education has to be in English. The teachers have to be they have to be capable of teaching, but the people that decide who's capable of teaching are the administrators of the school. So if you're creating your own school, you decide if you're capable of teaching or not. And if God gave you children, you probably have already experienced that you're able to teach them. So you can move on to the next thing, which is the instruction in the several branches of study required in the public schools. So that's the general topics that are taught in the public schools, and there's a list of them in the Ed Code. And in Chia's homeschool manual has a list of what those are and some ideas for how to teach those subjects, but they're literally as broad as math, science, social studies, arts. So those are the topics that you're required to teach. You're not required to teach California history in third grade, like public schools traditionally have done in California. You can teach history in whichever order you want to, start and end wherever you want to, and you can teach that history from the perspective that you want to, and use whatever curriculum you would like to do. So, and then the last couple of things on this list have to do with forms that you need to take care of. There are a couple of handouts in the back there if you'd like to have those. So there are certain records that you can keep, that you need to keep. The number one is you have to keep a record of attendance. And technically, the law says you need to record absences. Now, track with me here. If you've got a problem with your child being absent, you've got more than an attendance problem in school, right? You've got a runaway. So it's not really complicated to keep a track of attendance in your school because they're pretty much always, when your kids are there, right? Certain health records, there's forms like keeping track of vaccinations that have been completed. Technically in California, there are no vaccine requirements for private homeschool families. So if you are homeschooling privately, there's no law that says you have to have those vaccines. You just have to have a record that shows, it's usually referred to as the blue card, that lists out which ones have the student has. And that gets filed in their record with their record of absences from school. And then there's a couple of other forms, but those are in the manual and easy to find online. So as far as laws about homeschooling and how to qualify for homeschooling, there's no can I or can't I in terms of being allowed to homeschool. In California, if you establish your own private school in your own home, you get to decide what your school is called. And once a year, you tell the state, we have a school that meets here. That's what you do. You don't apply for a homeschool permit. You tell the state once a year, and the way that you do that is you file a form online, which is called a private school affidavit. It's you providing an affidavit to the state saying, that's just basically, that word affidavit just means a statement. You're saying to the state, I have a private school, and it's not an application because you're already meeting. It's the timeline for filing that form with the state is October 1st to 15th. So during that time, every year, every private school in the state files the same form, whether it's you with your one student in your home, or whether it's the Catholic school or the Montessori school down the street. These schools all file the same form once a year in October saying our school is in existence this year and we have approximately this number of students. That's what you do with the state. That's your only interaction with the state. Every once in a while, a larger school gets audited. I've never heard of a small school getting audited, but theoretically it could happen. It could happen. And by audited, I just mean somebody, usually from the Department of Health, comes through and just wants to make sure that you have the records, the forms in the file that you're supposed to have. Usually small schools don't get audited, but larger schools might, like the campus schools get audited every couple of years just to make sure that they have forms in there they're supposed to have. And then the affidavit that you file with the state is all online. There's a form that you file online, and if you have fewer than 5, if you have 6 or more students in your school, it gets listed in the private school directory that the state of California posts on the Department of Education's website. But if you have 5 or fewer, then you don't get listed anywhere. And then actually, if you do have a larger school, if you have 6 or more students and you don't want to be listed on the directory, all you have to do is just email the department and they'll not list you. It's pretty low key there. Pretty much every year I work with the department to see if they have any changes that they want to update that online form, and they're pretty easygoing about it right now. In past years, we've had to fight battles on them wanting to add more information onto the private school affidavit, and we've had to deal with that issue both in person with the department officials as well as in the legislature trying to pass laws that would require more information on that form. Fortunately, the law hasn't changed on that in over 30 years. I think the 70s might have been the last time it was changed. So, any questions on that so far? Yes.
The paperwork, it seems very basic, so it's not really overwhelming. Something you can do on your own.
Right.
There's a lot of YouTube things that walk you through, like question by question. So it takes all the guesswork out of it.
Okay, because
I think even Chia has something on their website.
Okay, yeah, because I'm just completely new to it, and I'm like, how do you do the attendance? Their forms,
Yeah, there's Chia has on their website and in their book, the Chia manual, they have sample pages that you can use. And they've been publishing that for years. Actually, my mom back in the 80s used the same forms that I use for my family now.
You still have it.
You still have it too, yeah.
Me too.
Yeah. So it is very basic, and there's not really a lot of changes. The affidavit, every once in a while, they've changed formatting on the private school affidavit online, but we update the Chia instructions on how to fill that out every year. As soon as it's online, I'm busy reviewing it line by line to make sure that everything's updated.
That's one of my questions.
Yeah.
As far as the school year, do you have to be, like, for example, if I were to put my kid in first grade and it starts in August, like the form is in October, is there any deadline?
No,
Do you have to start at a certain time? Do you have to have certain hours? Do you have to be Monday through Friday?
Good question. Good question. If I have it in here, but if you are hiring a private tutor for your children, there's actually a requirement that the private tutor teaches your children 175 days a year, and I think it's like 3 or 4 hours. I don't deal with private tutors very often, but for private homeschooling, for private schools at all, there's no list of hour requirements per day, and there's no day requirement per year. So you can say my school is year round, and you can take days off whenever you feel like it. Or you can have a more structured thing that's similar to your local public school if you want. You can do whatever you want and set your schedule however you feel works best for your family. Some families structure, and in fact, my family does this a little bit, where we structure our school year a little bit around when I can get time off. And so when our legislature is on break is typically when I get time off. So if that works for your family, then that's when how you can set up your schedule. Any other questions on the law for private homeschooling? There are seats in here if you want. Okay, let's go into the legislature a little bit and talk about that. And in California, we have a legislative process that's very similar to in DC that you may have learned about growing up, where we have two houses. We have a Senate and an Assembly here in California, just like at the federal level they have the Senate and Congress, and then we have the governor in California. I think everybody knows about the governor these days, and at the federal level we have the president. So at the federal level, we have legislation that goes through the legislature and then goes to the president, and the president can sign it or veto it. We have the same process here in California, where if you introduce a bill, it has to go through one house and then through the second house before it can go to the governor for his signature or veto. And I am always grateful that it takes a long time to go through the process for the legislature, because every time a bill has to go through some committee or another floor hearing or a vote somewhere, every one of those stops along the way, in my mind, is a chance for that bill to die. And in California, that means a lot, because we have very few good bills in California. We have a lot of bad stuff. And it is 10 times easier to stop a bad bill than it is to get a good bill passed. It's just very difficult in the makeup of our legislature here in California to get anything good done. So I have this chart here that helps me. And if you're interested in one of these, I have a few extra on my table in the exhibit hall if you'd like to pick one up. But this just follows the general process of the legislature. If a bill is introduced in the assembly first, then it would be called an AB, or an assembly bill. So it would be an AB and then have a number, and then it goes through committees. The Rules Committee determines which committees it goes to, and it goes to policy committees first, which is where they decide if the policy is good for us in California from their point of view. And then after policy committees, it goes to what is called a fiscal committee, or the appropriations committee, where they decide if they have enough money to spend on it from their point of view. And then after it goes through policy and fiscal committees, it goes to the floor. And every member of that house, in this case, an assembly bill, is in the assembly first. It goes to the floor of that assembly, and all of those assembly members vote on that bill to decide whether it goes to the other house. Now, in the assembly, we have 80 members in the assembly. So each of us, no matter where we live in California, we have an assemblyman or an assemblywoman who represent us in the assembly. Each assembly member represents about 500,000 people. And each senator, there's 40 senators, so half as many. So each senator represents about 1 million people in California. So when it gets to the floor, they vote on it, and all the assembly members vote. And if it passes, then it goes to the Senate. And the same thing happens in the Senate, where there's a rules committee that decides which committees it needs to go to. It might go to one committee, it might go to 2 committees, it might even go to 3 committees, which would be called triple referred. I love it when a bill gets triple referred, because that's 3 stops where it can get voted down instead of just 1 in a policy committee. So it goes to policy committees first in the Senate, then it goes to the fiscal committee, and they decide if they have the money for it. Then if it's been amended at all in the Senate, then it has to go through the assembly again to get those amendments concurred on, whether or not the assembly is okay with those amendments. Sometimes a bill goes back and forth a few times where everybody wants to amend the bill. Usually it gets amended 1 or 2 or 3 times along the way as it goes through the legislative process, and then it ends up going to the governor. Now, the tricky thing about our governor in California is that, at the federal level, if a bill goes to the president, he can sign it, and it becomes law, or he can veto it. That means say, I don't want this bill to pass, and then it dies, right? He sends it back to the legislature with his veto message on it. Or he can do what is called a pocket veto, right? and he sticks it in his pocket, and that means that it dies eventually. It dies after, I think it's 15 days. Well, in California, we don't have a pocket veto, we have a pocket pass. In California, if the governor puts it in his pocket, it automatically becomes law without his signature. So he has to either sign it to pass it into law, or veto it and send it back to the legislature, or if he does nothing with it, then it automatically becomes law. That's just wrong in my view. It doesn't happen very often. Usually he has an opinion one way or the other. So so that we don't see that much. But the governor's the last step before becoming law. So if a bill is going through this process, it has a lot of opportunities to be amended. It has a lot of opportunities for me to go in and talk to somebody privately and get them to change the wording. And most of the solutions to our problems with the legislature in California, in terms of homeschooling, are resolved that way. One example would be 3 years ago, I think it was 2019 or 18, there was a bill, SB2, that would have created a longitudinal database system. They call it the Cradle to Career system, where every student in California, their information and their educational data in terms of test scores and how they're doing on homework and things like that, attendance, all that stuff goes into this database. And in SB2, they wanted to include homeschoolers in that bill. And so all of us would have our information in that bill, in that database system. And California used to have a database system like that. It was created back in the 70s, and it kind of hobbled along in the 70s and in the 80s and in the 90s, and they dumped data into it. It was based only on the public schools putting data into it, and it never really got them what they wanted in terms of an outcome. And so during Jerry Brown's governorship, he actually used what's called a line item veto in the state budget one day to say, this isn't getting us anything good and it's costing us too much money. So he used his blue pen and he struck a couple lines out of the budget, and it saved us $11 million a year and dumped the whole system and the whole little agency that was running that department. And so a couple of people lost their jobs and the data system went away. So ever since that happened, I think it was in 2011, ever since that happened, there's been discussion on how to start that again. That would have been later than 2011. That was Schwarzenegger. It was like 14 or 15. So since then, there has been, I think, 12 bills to try to reinstitute that database system. And SB2 finally was making headway, but there was another bill that year that was also making headway that was a lot more vague. And SB2 did not pass that year, but I did get exemption language in there to keep private schools out of that bill. And we were able to get that wording in. And like I said, the bill died, but last week they were working on the budget. And the wording from SB2 was put in the budget in California. So this new state database system for the public schools that did not go through this process, I might add, it was in the state budget, which had a whole bunch of new stuff, new legislation that you wouldn't expect to show up in the budget, was popped into the budget at the last minute. And so they added a bunch of stuff, and one of the things in there was this Cradle to Career database system that they're funding now with California taxpayer dollars. And that SB2 language is in there, so they're going to require public schools to participate in this, but not private schools. So I'm really thankful that in a situation where we have the budget getting pushed through in a lot of closed door meetings, and they're writing this stuff without going through the regular process, we were able to have that language set up way ahead of time so that when they did put it in, it was ready to go with our exemptions again. So a lot of the work that we do is kind of like that, where we're working behind the scenes, trying to talk people into tweaking language here and there, and solving issues without being really political about it, without having a big fight that involves a lot of people. Now, sometimes there's nothing we can do. It's a political issue from the door, and we have to get people involved. And some of that has to do with getting people to come to the Capitol, or getting people to make phone calls. One time we were dealing with a mandatory kindergarten bill in Sacramento, and they were bringing it up for a vote the next day, and I was in a legislator's office talking about something else, and all the phones were really busy. And I said, "Man, it seems busy in your office today." And they said, "Yeah, that's your people calling about the kindergarten bill." And it just kind of made me feel proud of the homeschool community, that people they're caring about these issues. And folks at the Capitol, if they've been there long enough, they know that those homeschoolers, they care about issues. And if you meddle in what they're doing, they're gonna get worked up about it, and it's gonna cause them trouble. And in 2018, we had the one bill that actually went to committee, but there was another bill that had teacher certification, curriculum standards, other things for homeschooling, and that bill didn't get passed because the author pulled the bill because she got so many phone calls, none of her staff could do anything for a couple weeks. There was so many phone calls, they couldn't call out of their office because their phone lines were tied up. And so it matters when somebody says, "Hey, call your legislator," and you think, well, they don't agree with me on anything, so it's pointless. It's not pointless. It makes a difference, and legislators, they know that can make a big difference. And so I would encourage you to, next time you see an issue like that you care about, it's worth picking up the phone or going in and visiting if you can, or writing a letter to them, because those things do make a difference. So this year, I already mentioned the Cradle to Career thing. Earlier this year, we had a mandatory kindergarten bill, which was amended to only apply to students enrolling in public schools. So if that bill passes, which is still on hold in the California State Senate, if that bill passes, students going into first grade in public school would be required to have either already taken kindergarten or being told you need to go take kindergarten first before you can come into first grade. But we were able to get the private schools excluded from that bill. After, I think we probably had 20 different bills trying to do that over the last 30 years, trying to mandate kindergarten and earlier preschool years too. Yes?
So if there's an issue that you care about, how do you know where to go best? Who you need to call?
Great question. Great question. It can be frustrating sometimes because you don't know what the bill number is or something like that. But if you can get the bill number, there's a website. There's a link. If you go on my website, there's a link on the left for Find My Legislator, Track a Bill, things like that. It's in the Get Involved section right on the homepage of my website. And it's a really easy way to go and get that information. You can find out who your legislator is, type in a bill number and find out where this bill is and read what it actually says, because sometimes people will talk about a bill and you won't know what is real about it and what's conjecture, somebody getting worked up about it. And sometimes I've had people call me and say, well, what's going on with this bill? And it turns out it's a bill from another state they heard about on the radio, or it's a bill from Washington, D.C. And sometimes I get calls from people that have seen or heard a legislator talk about the bill that they haven't introduced yet. And sometimes that can be really helpful for me, because like that homeschool bill back in 1986, that hadn't been introduced yet. It was written and a bunch of people knew about it and they were already working on details, but it hadn't gone to a committee hearing yet. And so if you can catch a bill that's bad at that point, it's a lot easier to get an author to drop it then instead of after it's been introduced. So yeah, on our website, there's a website that you can type in a bill number, and you can get the information about where is the bill at, where has it been so far, what have the votes been, how did my legislator vote on it, things like that. It can be really helpful. Any other questions?
I have a
Yes.
question.
Yes.
In your pamphlet, it says that you do not advocate for the charter schools.
Right.
Can you
Yeah.
dive into that?
Yeah, so on this, let's see, this chart, it shows it shows the different options on this chart. We have, on the right-hand side is the public programs. We have public schools under different types of public schools. And then we have, on the left side, we have the different kinds of private schools. So on the right-hand side, you'll see charter schools are there with campus-based and traditional public schools. They're under the authority of the public, the big picture public schools, and the authority is the California Department of Ed for curriculum, for teaching standards, for things like that. If you go with the private side, and this is what our organization was founded to protect, is the freedom to have your own authority in your own private school, to make your own decisions for what you're going to teach, who's going to teach, how you're going to teach it, things like that. So for my school, I want to be able to teach my kids based on the Bible. And technically, our Constitution in California says that in any one of those public options, you're not allowed to do that. It's illegal. So anytime that there's state funding involved in the education, any one of those public options, you can't have the same level of freedom to direct the education in your school. So if you're homeschooling over here with a charter school program, you have to, at some level, at some point, answer to the person in the charter school. And this is getting more and more strict now than it used to be. Originally, they were a lot more lenient on things, but if you're establishing your own private school, it's going to be a lot more flexible in terms of your freedom to choose what you're going to teach. You can use Christian curriculum for every subject and not be afraid of that, and not have to cover up anything that you're doing because the state doesn't want to see you using Christian textbooks for teaching. So that's the main issue, is who's in charge. If God gave you the children, it's your responsibility to raise them, and if you feel like God gave you that responsibility, then that's the best, most free option. Now, charter schools, you're going to be more flexible than a traditional public school because you're doing some teaching at home with your kids. And depending on what kind of program you're at, you may have them for all the time or some of the time. You might be in a class here or there, but it's not the most free option. The most free option is private home education. The charter schools might be a stop along the way toward ultimate freedom, but it's the most free option in California today, and I hope it stays this way, is private home education in California. And hopefully, if we can stick together, we'll keep the freedom that we have there, which is a lot. We have a lot of freedom to be able to teach what we want there. So, does that answer your question? Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Yes.
As far as like if you teach your children, let's say I teach them all the way through high school and they want to go to college, how does that work as far as like credit?
Yeah. That's a good question. There are a lot of options for dual enrollment, and there's so much flexibility in homeschooling that as far as getting into college, which is one question, homeschoolers typically don't have any trouble and are often actually recruited to get into big name colleges. In California, there are a couple of issues with certain state schools admitting students as freshmen into like the Cal State universities as freshmen. It's not always an issue, but it can be in California. But for most schools, there's not an issue, and many times you'll see homeschoolers graduate from high school at age 17 or 18 with already having an associate's degree from a junior college or from another college through, with homeschooling you can be flexible since you're the one running it. You can help your child be more prepared for getting into college by sort of arranging their high school years around what college classes are available that they can do dual enrollment, where you can do that either with junior college in your area or somewhere else in the state. You can actually right now do dual enrollment with any junior college in the state of California, or through some other college. You can do it through a Christian college. A lot of Christian colleges' rates for online or in-person college through dual enrollment is those rates are getting lower and lower over time. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, because somebody just found it could be difficult if I homeschool and then, later on, I might not apply to colleges, and so I was just concerned about that.
Yeah, most of the time people are very shocked at how easy it is to get into college after homeschooling. Yes.
Just one note, my wife was homeschooled all the way to through high school, and she still got into UCLA, so it's not like.
Yep. I actually have a funny story about college because I was homeschooled all the way through and then went to college. And my first year of college, I wanted to take an upper division political science class. And the head of the department told me, yeah, you were homeschooled, I'll let you take the class. If you weren't homeschooled, I would have said no. Because homeschool students know how to learn and it's not going to cause trouble if you're a homeschool student in it. So I was pretty surprised about that. So there are benefits, even in colleges. They start to recognize the ability to learn for themselves, because homeschool students have sort of they're kind of known for thinking on their own that way. So yeah, well, thank you for coming. Hopefully that was helpful, and stick around. There's lots of other helpful information here this afternoon too.